Ron, I'm excited to have you with us today. Why don't you share with our audience a little bit about how you came to this place as a pastor, as a successful business person, and as a leader of Leadership Network?
Thanks, Joe. And I just have to say a personal note. You were a great friend while I was living in Dallas, and so I appreciate your friendship that way too. Um, I am living in Tennessee. Again, we grew up here and love being here, but went through a season at Leadership Network and really missed just the hands-on of the local church. And an opportunity came to help out my home church in the process of transitioning back to Tennessee. And so it just worked. And so we did not see all of this coming, but it worked out to really well that we landed in a church that had been without a pastor for about 2 years and able to, I think, come at a good time for them and for us.
Ron, tell us a little bit about the church you're serving right now, what your experience is, because you're going to talk about what it's like to be a pastor in this day and in this setting. So tell us a little bit about your circumstances there.
Yeah, so this is a church that's 180 plus years old and has had lots of great seasons, planted lots of churches over the years. Has over the last 10 years or so, which is not that uncommon, been somewhat in a period of decline, and not really somewhat. It's been in a period of decline, and so it's been a tougher season. Had some really unique circumstances that have happened to it over the past few years, and again, been without a pastor a couple of years. So really trying to, just as so many older established churches are, trying to reestablish themselves, and refine their ways. It's a downtown church, takes up a large portion of downtown, a large footprint in downtown Clarksville, Tennessee. I think there's some 14 acres, over 300,000 square foot of building space. It's just a really big complex. And because with a lot of downtown churches at one time, and still even some today, has a huge influence in the community. We are a military town, which makes it unique in and of itself. We have a ton of military in our community and in our church, and love our military. This is a town that embraces the military. So just a lot of unique characteristics, and yet probably share a lot in common with a lot of churches that will be listening today.
Excellent. Well, Ron, why don't we get right to it? The first question we've got for you is, what has changed for you since COVID-19 outbreak and social distancing?
Well, can I say my whole world has changed? Like literally everything has changed. Certainly changed from what I thought I'd be doing this month, and we just celebrated Easter, and Easter was totally different than anything I ever experienced. And again, that's not that different from any other church in America, but I think there's a few things that I would highlight most that have changed. One is making harder decisions I ever thought I'd have to make as a leader. Closing our church building, and we were, again, one of the larger churches in town. We were the first to make the decision we were closing. And after that, before the weekend was over, all the larger churches had decided they were going to go virtual that first Sunday, and that was just hard. I mean, I remember it was a Friday afternoon, and I remember watching the news and listening to other churches around the country, and just the stress involved in that was literally huge. And had some people saying, "Hey, this is way too early," and some, thinking we should have already done it. So just the level of complexity of decisions is harder today than ever. The second thing I would say is we're on information overload. So much information out there right now, what we should be doing, or what we could be doing, or what we will be doing. And it's just really difficult. It's why I'm glad you're doing this, because we need trusted resources during this time, reliable resources. one of the things that I have agreed to do as I've had an opportunity to talk to other churches is I'm only going to speak with people I already know and trust, just because I can't, you know, I don't want to be a part of misinformation out there either. You know, there's just so much information out there. So we got to really know who to trust during these days. The third thing I'd say is I found myself with a wide range of emotions, and I'm pretty steady person. I'm usually the calm in the room, and hey, we're going to get through this and the push through it. This is just really kicked you some days. I mean, some days you wake up and you're like, wow, man, I didn't see this coming, and I didn't. And so the range of emotions that our people are going through, I think pastors are going through too. Thankfully, I've not had anger yet, you know, and that is certainly a process in grief, and I've not gotten there. But so much disappointment because I'd been here 3 weeks when this really took off. It started making the news, and then about 5 weeks when we had to make the decision not to meet again. And it's just disappointing because we were just starting to get some traction, you know, and people were excited, and so disappointment and fear and all the things that you'd expect. At the same time, just a lot of excitement, you know. Some days I'm like, man, then we get to try something new, and I love change, and I love encouraging change and that sort of thing. So I've had some just real days of that. I'm just bouncing off the wall, ready to go and try to tackle this, you know. And then the other thing is that I think has changed, and I'm really kind of excited about this one, Joe, is there seems to be a sense of urgency among churches that I've not seen in a while.
Yes, yes.
You've seen that too, haven't you?
Absolutely,
I mean,
absolutely.
among your clients probably. And so I'm super excited that, you know, we always say desperation causes innovation, and I'm excited about the opportunities this is creating, and also a sense of unity among churches. I mean, I've got a text string going with some local pastors right now, and they're just sharing information freely. You know, that's a blessing, right? I mean, that we should be embracing that. So that I think that's a positive thing. We're truly in this together. And then the last thing I would say that's changed, I said this in a blog post recently, not quite like this, but Jesus is cool again. You know, it really is. It appears to me right now that it's okay to be claiming your faith right now and to be holding on to your faith during this time. And man, we need to take advantage of that. If ever before, now's the time. And so I think that has changed faster than any of us saw coming.
Well, thanks, Ron. Let me just say something to our viewers as we get started. We've got these questions that we advertise, and we're going to be asking Ron these, but you're also going to have an opportunity to ask questions. And so there's a button on your controls called Q&A. You can click on those. You can ask questions of Ron. We're not going to get to those until after we've gone through the first 5 questions. You can also put a thumbs up beside a question that you like, and that will help it to rise to the top of the questions that we are looking at here. So just a quick note to the audience. All right, so the second question: what does pastoring an online community look like in comparison to a traditional community setting?
Well, and thankfully we had some experience with this at Leadership Network, but I have always, not always, but most of my pastorate, we've had an online contingency. So we've played with this some in the past, but trying to figure out who your audience actually is different. I mean, when you can see them and talk to them, you kind of know more about them. But when they're sitting on the other side of a computer screen, it's hard to know their needs. It's hard to know, their backgrounds, where they come from, what their culture and context is. so that you can speak into their life in the way that's most meaningful to them. So just understanding your audience is so much more difficult. But I would say also your audience is broader, and that's a good thing. We have seen our audience grow almost 12 times what the in-person audience was, which is amazing. But that was Easter's statistics. So your audience is much broader. And we have to understand that people are listening to us now and watching us that have never done so before, and that's very, very important. I think also the more we can even though we know it's a broader audience, the more we can localize it, the better off we are. I always tell pastors, and this is true when you're writing a book also, you write a book to your audience. You pick your target. When I wrote a book for leadership, on leadership, I was thinking of a leader that's in their first 10 years of leadership. And that helped me focus my message. So even though we're speaking to a broader audience, the more we can speak to our audience, those closest to our church, I think the better we'll be coming out of this, of actually being able to minister to the people that we can truly help. And I think there's a tendency to know, okay, I got people listening. We had 9 countries in 29 states listening to us for Easter. There's a tendency for me, okay, I get to pastor in Rwanda now. Well, that's great. And you may be able to, and you may be able to add some value there, but you're not going to be able to really meet the needs of that community effectively, unless you're, a really, really mega church. So I think understanding, the more we can understand our audience in an online community, the more effective we'll be. But the other, and the last difference there, online versus in person, and I hope this changes, to be honest, but the current context right now is I'm producing more content than I ever produce. There's this sensation, this sense that people are sitting at home and they're absorbing so much content, and they are. But if we're going to disciple them, we have to be a voice alongside of that. Otherwise, who knows what they're going to be listening to. And so I have this sense as a pastor that I've got to produce, they got to hear from me more often than just Sunday morning. So I've got to do a video update on Monday morning. I got to do a video update, devotionals through the week. And that doesn't have to be all me, but people within the church and different staff members and that sort of thing. The amount of content creation we're doing right now is absolutely overwhelming.
Yeah, we just had a national brand expert, Kim Meyer, who was speaking to that very issue. Those listeners who would like to go deeper into trying to decide what to communicate and what to produce in this moment can, inside of Giving 365, look up the webinar that was done by Kim Meyer on communicating in times of social distancing impact. So, Ron, I hear you. I'm hearing that from our pastors, that they are busier now than they've been, that staffs are busier than they've ever been, especially around the content creation. You talked about bringing it home in worship for your church, your community, even though you're communicating to people worldwide on online worship. Can you give an example of what you have done to contextualize your message there in Clarksville that our listeners can chew on?
Yeah, one of the things is telling more stories. So talking about the impact in the community that we are seeing, or that even others are seeing. So sharing more stories locally and that sort of thing. And then the other thing is to, whether it's through Facebook Live or whatever format you have, and they seem to be the easiest to do this, is actually engaging with those people that are local, and right. We have onboarded our, and we don't have anything original. We've borrowed from everybody else, but we've onboarded some of our greeters that would have been handing out bulletins on the door to get online and engage with people. And this week really seemed to step that up, but just localizing it more, so talking about it. I talk about our city leaders, county leaders that I've engaged with, talking about them, talking about projects and ways of help in our community, and sharing those constantly too. So just continuing to just get local, talk local. So again, the tendency is to speak to the broader audience. I want to narrow it down and speak to the local context again.
I like your emphasis on trying to engage the community online. The church that my wife and I attend broadcast on Facebook Live, and they're doing a great job of curating messages down the side. People are essentially cheering and amening the pastor with emojis and stuff that are floating over the screen. And what we have experienced, and it's really surprised us, what we have experienced is a greater sense of connection there than we often do in the pew setting, because there's only those around us and we're all focused on what the pastor's saying. But we actually have experienced greater community engagement online. And I think that's going to have some implications for our church as we come through this. I know we're going to talk about that later. So I'm going to jump on to...
I'm not afraid, Joe, to ask for an amen online, and I've done that. I've said exactly this several times. Look, if you were in the room, I'd be asking for an amen. Type it in, So I'm not afraid to do that.
That's a great suggestion. All right, next question. How are you communicating with your church and your staff during this time? We delved into that a little bit earlier. Why don't you go deeper on that question now?
Yeah, so our staff, many of them, or several of them, had not heard of Zoom until all this came about, but we're in a lot of meetings with Zoom. One of the things that I knew early on, and one of my strengths is organizational leadership, I knew early on we had to divide and conquer. So every Zoom call couldn't involve everybody, the same way you wouldn't if you were in the church building with large staffs or large teams or large volunteers. Everybody in the room is not going to accomplish very much. And so the more you can divide out and have separate Zoom calls with 4 rather than 14 or 3 rather than 6, it's just so much easier. So we, the first week or so, we divided into 4 teams, and I can share those: worship, discipleship, care, and outreach, and divided all of our staff among them. And this contextualizes if you have volunteers, same thing. But putting them on to different teams, they meet individually, and I don't meet with them. And then we come back and synthesize that information once a week. And part of my job is to guide the process so that we're continually, as soon as this is over, we're jumping on another call, another Zoom call, and saying, okay, what have we done since we talked last week, and what are we going to do? And we're working in kind of like phases. So we had phase 1, and then we had phase 2, and then we have phase 3 of response as we know things are unfolding. But I would say, a couple of things as far as engaging the team. Try to make them feel they're not alone, because they feel alone right now. Mm-hmm. So every one of our staff, our children's pastor, or again, contextualizing for a children's volunteer, doesn't need to feel like they're alone. They need to be on a Zoom with their peers too. So making sure that's happening, because we are alone, right? I mean, I'm the only one in the building today. And then the thing I would say to pastors is you got to trust your team. More than ever in this season, you got to put trust in your team. And that means you're empowering people you can't see. You can't trust that you got to trust they're doing the work. So set some goals, set some accountability, and then measure for completion and progress. And those are all things we should have been doing all along. That's good leadership. It's even more important in this digital age, in this online, that we probably will experience some of this from now on. It's going to make us better leaders because good leaders trust their teams even when they can't see their team, right? And then the last thing I would say is, and I'm going to say this to our team again, and I've said it every week, don't be afraid to take a risk and don't be afraid to take the lead. You don't have to wait for me to do the right thing. So you don't have to wait for me. I've told our church over and over and over again, you don't have to wait for me to give you permission to pick up the phone and call someone and see how they're doing.
Right.
You don't need a program. You don't need a call list. You know people in the church who you used to sit by them in church. You need their number. We can get it for you. But take initiative and lead in this crisis. Minister, be the church during this. Sometimes people just need permission to do things. Give them permission. They will sit and wait for you to tell them that sometimes, but give them the right, the opportunity to go out and serve people. And we're doing that with our staff. We're doing that with our church.
It's an excellent observation. There may be people, our listeners out there, you may have people in your pews that feel like they're waiting for permission. And so to lean forward and to encourage them that they don't need any more permission than they already have to get out and be the church. Excellent. Well, Ron, what does pastoring an online community look like? I think we've done that one. What do your next 4 to 8 weeks look like strategically?
Well, this is where we are currently. There is we have been respecting our government leaders, which we are commanded to do, and I think it's 1 Peter, but Romans 13. And so we have been in touch with them, trying to do the right thing, trying to be good community partners. There's going to be a balance over the next 4 to 8 weeks between respecting our government leaders continually and thinking how and when are we going to reopen our doors, and in what ways, even in a limited way. And so we're likely going to come back in layers. That'd be my guess, where we will gradually do things, whether groups of 10 and then groups of 50. I don't know what that looks like yet, but the balance there of shut down versus reopening is going to be the biggest over the next 4 to 8 weeks, I believe. And that's contextual too, depending on where you are in the country. We're in Tennessee. Nashville's been hit pretty hard, but Clarksville, where we are, our leadership has been probably stronger in a shutdown mode than even some of the state, but that's helped. And so the curve is flattening. And so we're now looking at, okay, what's the next steps going forward? So I think that is probably on top of everybody's mind. I think the second thing I would say is that people, and I've been saying to our staff, every week this goes, people will get deeper in those stages of emotions and grief that I mentioned earlier. They're more tired. They're more, frustrated with this. They're more anxious to get out. They're more anxious to do something. The longer this goes, the more bored people get with the same old thing. And so we have to be thinking, as I said earlier, phase 2, phase 3, and so on. So what do we do now in this day? So every week you almost have to reevaluate everything you're doing and what do people need today? That's where that localized contextualization becomes so important, of knowing your people and what they need, and knowing that what you did with them last week, just offering them an online service and an online Zoom opportunity, may not be enough. They need something else, and really thinking through what we give them. And then the third thing that I would say that we are currently doing, and I just blogged about this week, but we're working with our leadership during this season to ask 3 questions. What do we keep? So what are we going to keep doing after this is over? It worked. We didn't even know it would work as well as it did, whether that's the online ministries and that sort of thing. But what are we going to keep after this is all over? What are we going to tweak? So we got to get better at this in the future. And then the third thing is, what are we going to throw away? I almost use the term kill, but that doesn't work as well in church context. But we have to stop doing some things if we're going to take on new things. We are still going to be limited in the number of people and the number of volunteers and all that sort of stuff, and we can only do so much. And to be effective, we limit our what we do anyway. So those three things are going to kind of shape for us the conversation around what does the next season look like for us. And that next season, maybe that's this summer, maybe that's this fall, maybe it's even into the next year of what do we keep, what do we tweak, and what do we throw away.
So even in this, as early as we are in this cycle, and it was so much in uncertainty in front of us, you're already starting those conversations with your staff.
I think you have to, and I think you have to have them ahead of time. Now, again, I tell our staff too all the time, make plans with an open hand. So we have to realize the plans we made today may not work tomorrow. This is ever evolving. We're building the plane as we fly it. But if you wait until, okay, the government comes out and says, okay, you can open your church buildings. Well, as soon as they do, your people are ready. And some are going to be afraid, but some are going to be ready to come and go, and you may not be ready for them. You may not. And then the other thing is, if you rush back to normal, as close to normal as you can get to, you may be ignoring some of the opportunities that this crisis have created, such as the online ministries, and you will you'll just miss some things God is open doors for the gospel. For example, I mentioned earlier, texts going back and forth between pastors in our community. That's a good thing.
Right.
What could we come out of this and do together? And so I think having those conversations on the front end before all this will at least, and I would approach them in principle, not in practice. So in other words, these are the broad principles we're going to look at. We're not necessarily going to do all these. It's not going to be exactly the way because we don't know what that looks like yet. But in principle, here's some things we want to do going forward. And one of those, for example, I mentioned this in numerous places, we are going to have to redo some of our governing structures in our churches. We need to start having those conversations now. If this happened, we're violating some of our bylaws. Hope none of our church members are listening to this, but I'm just kidding. I hope they are. But we are. We had to make some decisions, and our bylaws keep us from making those decisions until we have our church together. That just wasn't practical. We had to make those decisions. We had to continue to meet people's needs and that sort of thing. We may need to step back and say, okay, maybe there needs to be a second look at our governing structure in a local context, in a denominational context, whatever that context is, that says churches have to be able to react in the moment. That's just the day we're living in. We don't have the freedom to sit back and wait for the answers to come. Sometimes we have to get ahead of that.
So Ron, what I've heard you say is you are looking for what are the ongoing opportunities? What do we learn here that we can that we want to hold on to as we go forward? And what are those things that we are already doing, but we need to adjust to take advantage of the learnings and what this is going to look like as we emerge? And then there's an opportunity to quit doing some things that are not as productive for us as they may have been in the past. And you didn't exactly put it like that, but there's an opportunity for some pruning. You talked about the necessity, if we're going to take on more, we've got to let go of something. Every church has got a Back to Egypt committee. Now, you may not have been there long enough, and so you're probably not going to be able to speak in terms of your local church. But what do you say to pastors who know their Back to Egypt committees well and who are looking forward to the day when all of this is behind us and nothing's going to be different? It's going to be just like it used to be. What kind of counsel do you give to pastors who are looking at an awareness, things will be different, and yet groups in the church that don't want to embrace what may come out the other side.
Well, and I would say a couple of things there. One, the way you led through this crisis is going to determine the credibility you developed on the other side. And I say that lovingly because I love pastors. One of the reasons I do what I do is because I love pastors. But if you sat back and completely waited for everything to happen, you're not. You have to lead through this, and I think there's still time to do that. To say, guys, or church, we got to move forward. We have to make some decisions. So I think the leadership you provide during this time will help you greatly on the other side. It's also a period that if you did do that, I think change is going to be able to be made faster than we may have in the past, even for some of our oldest, most traditional, most change-resistant churches out there, because every church in America has been disrupted, and it was sudden, it was fast, it was unexpected. And so now I think there's going to be a sense of, okay, that's where leadership comes in to say, here's a vacuum that we can step in and move this thing forward. And again, not to oversimplify something, but that's called leadership 101. And so I think as pastors, if I were counseling you right now, I would say now's the time to put your best vision casting hat on, write your best sermons around change management and change. Learn from all the resources that are out there. You're providing great resources, Joe, and they're great resources. Learn from all those, and then step into this season and say, we're going to lead our way out of this. I'm not saying, it's not a silver bullet. I'm not saying you're going to be able to change the world and all that sort of stuff. I think there's opportunities here that we didn't have 3 months ago. And the difference will be whether we lead into that or not. And I do a lot of work with church revitalization. It's probably one of my specialties. Not every church can be changed, and not every church can be saved. And frankly, some churches may not make it well on the other side of this. But if you have people who love the mission, love Christ, want to make disciples, lead with those people. And I think on the other side of this, we can actually be stronger as churches as a whole.
So Ron, looking out 6 to 8 weeks, I heard you say you working with your local officials and government about what reopening might look like. You've been an elected official, so you've sat on the other side of the table as a servant of the people in an elected sense. What do you think reopening is going to look like? I know it's just a guess, but we spoke yesterday, and I don't think you have the sense that there's going to be a day that everything just goes back to normal. It's going to look different.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it'll have to, and it'll depend on the community. You're down in Texas, your governor's saying different things than the governor north of me in Kentucky is. They're just almost complete opposites in how they're approaching this. The governor of Tennessee is probably a little bit in between those two. So it really is going to depend on local leadership and state leadership. And for me, I'm listening to local leadership first, state leadership second, national leadership third. Obviously, all of those can be trumped, but I'm trying to, the national can trump the state and the state can trump the local. But I am trying to reach this community. So to not cooperate with these community leaders would be idiotic, and it would shoot yourself in the foot trying to reach the community. I've even talked to our sheriff, who is trying to implement measures to, of enforcement of the stay-at-home orders and that sort of thing, and told him, hey, we're going to be our best cooperative people we can possibly be. But on the other side, I think the smartest leadership is probably going to guide us the same way things gradually closed, things are going to gradually open so that we, there are going to be new cases, there's going to be new exposure, but we can gradually come back to a full opening. As a church leader, if our government leader, I'm just being totally hypothetical here, but if our government leaders said, okay, today, on Tuesday, you can open Sunday, I think we would probably, as a church, knowing what we know about, the healthcare and all of those things, I think we would still step back and say, okay, but how do we want to do it this week? And we would want to ease into it. So hopefully government does that, but we do have to take care of people, right? I mean, we have to care for our people. And I'm always on the optimist side, I'm a cautious optimist. So I'm like, let's get going, but I also realize the realism of this, that we have to be smart about how we go about it and strategic, because you can there's a reason when you go to a concert, and I hope we get to do those again, and ball games and all that they have procedures to get people out and in, because a herd can get in trouble real fast. And so we have to be smart about that. And I think it'll come back in layers.
So Ron, in preparing for this conversation, we talked about the challenges that large churches face, that maybe your local government will say, okay, you can have a group of 100, or you can have a group of 200 in this season, and yet maybe you worship 500 or 1,000 or a larger number. How do you see churches dealing with that? Do they wait to open, or are there ways that they can embrace the limitations and still do in-person worship services?
Well, one of the things that I think, I was saying this at Leadership Network for the whole time I was there, because we operated on the innovation curve, that the largest churches impacted the next size, and impacted the next size, and impacted the next size. And one of the things I was saying is I think innovation occurs differently these days. You give somebody a computer and the internet, and they can change the world, literally. And some of the biggest music stars just started filming themselves at home with an app,
Right.
And so I think I would say to every pastor listening, don't be afraid to be the innovator. Don't be afraid to teach us how to do it.
All right, let's move on to last question. How are you practicing self-care during the season of intense leadership?
Well, when I speak at conferences, the last thing I always say to pastors is you have to take care of your soul. No one will take care of your soul for you. And if you're not taking care of yourself, you're not going to be able to take care of the church. And so I'm glad you ended with that question, because it may be the most important. On the airplane, they tell you to put, and hopefully we get to ride on those again. They tell you to put your mask on first before you help somebody else. And that's because you can't help them if you don't have your own oxygen. So I'm pretty disciplined in this area of my life, but I try to exercise most every day in some way. I'm trying to get outside as much as I can. I'm taking prayer walks and kind of leading the church on a prayer walk with me. It helps being downtown, and we can pray for our city, the other churches, pray for our university that's here. Staying real close to my wife, knowing that she experiences this different from me. So trying to make sure she's got adequate time with me, and we have adequate time together. I like to cook, and so I'm trying to do that every night, and just doing some cooking at home. And really trying not to work all the time, even though there's plenty to be done, and I could always be working.
All right. Well, we're going to open up the question and answer for people in the audience. I've got questions of Ron. I've got one right here from Clayton Smith. Clayton was a stewardship pastor at one of the largest, or the largest Methodist church, Church of the Resurrection in the Kansas City area. And Clayton says, I went through a crisis of grief and loss early in my ministry, and I started recovery groups, and growth resulted. Helping others really helped me grow deeper and closer to God and our Lord's healing power. What role do you see for recovery groups in the local church after we get back together?
Well, I think the question kind of answers the question. I hadn't thought in terms of recovery groups, but I interviewed a local therapist recently, and we've continued to broadcast that on our channels, knowing that in crisis like this, the care of our soul is probably one of the most important things we can do, and that's for our people as well. Pastors, we've talked about it this entire time, pastors are under enormous amount of stress right now for so many reasons, as we all are. But pastors are a unique group. Again, if we can't care for ourselves, we can't take care of our churches. And so I think the idea of a recovery group is a tremendous idea. I'm meeting with, I have just taken it upon myself to put 2 pastor groups together. And there's no coaching involved. We're all peers. We're not trying to charge anybody or anything else, but we're just checking on each other. We're doing it bi-weekly, and we're just jumping on saying, here's what we're going through, here's what we're experiencing, and just being there for each other. So I think the answer is in the question. We're going to have to think of ways to care for pastors during this time.
Ron, you lead a large church, have led large churches, but most of the churches in America are small, 50 to 100 in worship or are smaller. What advice do you have for them? And these churches may disproportionately have larger numbers of seniors who are not digitally savvy. That's coming from a question from Vivian, and Betty's asking that same question about small rural communities in smaller churches.
Well, my first church was in a small town of 2,000, or I don't even know if we had 2,000. We had 1,200, and was a small church. And what I would say is, one, don't try to be anybody else. Practice, copy principles, not practices. But 2, you may have a better unique opportunity to minister during this time than some of the larger churches, because I don't know where all our people are. I mean, we had 11,000 engage with us Sunday. I don't know even how to minister to those. But thinking small during this time is actually very helpful. So what I would say is the same principle that I should not try to lead this large church by myself. In a rural community, even if you're bivocational, you should not try to do it yourself. You should do all the things that I mentioned, take care of yourself, practice self-care, take time off, all those sort of things. But you got to think, how can I engage people during this time? And it's kind of what we talked about before. Give people permission to care for one another. If you've got 50 people, think of yourself into 5 teams. If you could find 5 people who could, hey, here's your 10, take care of them. And just call them on a regular basis. If they need some groceries and you can get out and pick them up and take them to their house or drop them off at the door, you don't even have to go in, do some of that. But think smaller during this time. But I also would say, don't underestimate the senior population in terms of how they can catch on to technology. I realized for what I could do with my mom, who's in a senior care facility, if I gave her some direct links, she could go there and she could engage. She wouldn't engage at the same level, but it has been a real ministry to her to be able to not feel quite as isolated. But and she's a perfect example. Giving my mom permission to pick up the phone and call people has been a real blessing to her. So she's calling 4 or 5 a day, and she's in a facility where she gets 1 hour a day out of her room. And but that phone has been a real blessing to her. I think I would the best advice I think I could give is don't try to, I can't do this because I'm too small. Think I can do this because I'm small. And there's a total difference in that perspective.
Excellent advice, Ron. So Carrie's asking this question. What advice do you have for church revitalization post-COVID-19?
Well, I said earlier, I think you're going to be able to change faster. It's going to require leadership, but we have been in an environment of change, and the necessity is evident now that we got to move forward. We got to have change. I think I would be asking the same questions that you probably would ask. I have a friend in Nashville, leads a large church there, that has been saying for years the term future church. And I loved that phrase. And he said to me recently, we've been thinking future church was coming in the next 10 years. It's coming now. And this crisis has done that. So I think I would be asking the same basic revitalization questions now that I would have asked before. I would just ask them faster. And it has brought them to a contextualization that now we have to have some help. So one question, and these are hard questions, but church revitalization is a hard subject. But can this church be saved? And can we really turn this church around? Is there enough energy here? Is there enough? Are there enough resources? Are the people motivated to do so? Jesus didn't guarantee every local church. He guaranteed the greater church. So maybe it's a time to think, I think church mergers are going to occur faster now than they ever have. Maybe it's a time, maybe you've had some thoughts about that, whether that was even an issue. Maybe it's time to have some of those conversations. Maybe it's a time to think, okay, they have this strength, we have this strength. How could we do that better together? Maybe it's a time to reach out to some of the larger churches and say, are you looking for expansion through other means? So asking some of those hard questions. If you can move forward, then I think it gets back to real simple basics of church revitalization. And you're going to share my blog post in a little while. And I'm not trying to promote my stuff at all, but I've written a ton about church revitalization. It's simply strategically working some plans to move things forward. I think that can happen, and I think it can happen faster now than it could have before this crisis began.
Ron, thanks for sharing that. And in fact, I want to thank you for being with us today. We're coming to the close of our hour together. And before we leave, I want to give you an opportunity to tell our listeners a little bit about what you are doing in regard to helping other churches, what resources are available through your website and through your ministry.
Well, I've been blogging through the website there for a number of years and just really have a strong desire to help the local church. I came out of the business world into the church and saw a lot of just really basic leadership and business principles. The church is not a business, but there are business principles and leadership principles at play to help churches be healthy and make more disciples. And so I've always had this sense, if God gives me the opportunity of wanting to help churches, and so I've done that for years through my blog. We're in the process of launching a podcast very soon, and we'll be doing that in partnership with Lifeway, and look forward to that in the weeks ahead. Supposed to do it this month, but that got delayed, so we're doing that. But one of the things that I would really love to do is, I've used the term adjunct staff member, is come along, whether that's in a virtual sense or in an in-person sense, once that's allowed, and work with churches to just kind of be an adjunct staff member of your church and help you think through strategically, where are we going and what are we doing and how are we going to get there? That's just what I enjoy doing.